My name is Ruben Nelson, and I am the 2018 recipient of the Don Michael Award. The presentation you're going to see is the one I made in San Francisco, December 1st, 2018, at the Don Michael Day of Learning. Let me begin by saying a word about Don. You can see from his face that he loved life. He had a childlike curiosity about the world, an insatiable curiosity. And that's one of the places that he and I deeply connected, wondering how did these things come about? And what were the drivers behind that? I'm honored to have my name associated with his. So I want to thank those who came to San Francisco, as well as all of you who are watching this later. At the end, you'll find ways to contact me, and if you have comments or challenges, I would welcome hearing from you. When Don was given an honorary degree from Saybrook University, he made some observations regarding a missing elephant. I want to riff off his title and make some observations with regard to a missing question. Under the heading of civilizational overshoot and rebirth. Now, in what sense is the question missing? Is it missing like car keys, which may just be under the newspapers at the end of the counter? Or is it missing the way that if you're late, you can miss a bus? Well, let's go with the International Futures Forum to India in 2006. IFF spent 2 weeks there, and as they were in Mumbai, ready to fly home, in their final meeting, doing an assessment of the time together, one of them asked, well, what have we missed? And their Indian host, in a way that those of you who know and love India will not be surprised, said in a gentle and quiet voice, only that which you cannot yet see. And that's the sense in which the question is missing. I think we in modern industrial cultures cannot yet see the questions I'm trying to raise. Now, it may turn out that the questions are trivial and it doesn't matter. It also may turn out that our future hangs on them. So let's take the first cut at the missing question. My formal training is in philosophy, and therefore it's natural I'd turn to Wittgenstein, who was once asked, what is your aim in philosophy? And he said somewhat enigmatically, to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. Now that's not a normal philosophical comment, but you can see the fly bottle there, and as you know, you put sugar water or something that attracts flies in the bottom, you cut out the top so that flies can come along, sense the sugar water, fly down through the neck of the first bottle and into the second. Now, flies have evolved enough that they can actually do all of that. So they can get themselves into that situation, and once there, they think they've struck gold. They've got space, they've got food, what could possibly go wrong? Except, of course, that when they want to get out, they find themselves in a situation that their evolutionary capacity hasn't developed yet to the point that they can make sense of where they are. And unable to make sense of where they are in the situation they're in, they die. Well, you can see where I'm going with this. What if we who are modern cannot yet see and understand, let alone escape from, the global culture and progress traps in which we now find ourselves? What if the heart of the threats to our future is modernity itself, and not just some of its unintended consequences? What if we moderns are in civilizational overshoot? Now, I dare say that that phrase civilizational overshoot may be new to you, and so, as philosophers do, we stipulate what we mean. And so, here's what I mean by overshoot. We'll start there because it's easiest and it's more familiar. As you probably know, it's a term that has been used a lot in ecology, and you can see the coyote-rabbit cycle down in the bottom left-hand corner. My wife and I can see that acted out in our front yard because we live in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta. And overshoot is when you have learned behaviors in a particular situation, and you continue those behaviors because they've worked for you. And that's really important to understand. Overshoot is not about being bad or evil. Overshoot is about context insensitivity. That is, you continue to behave in ways that did work, but without noticing the situation you're in is profoundly changed and calls for some new forms of behavior. And so you can see that blue arrow that goes along, and if you keep trucking along the blue arrow, you miss all the signals that say you should take the yellow brick road and change your trajectory. And if you don't do that, you end up where that purple dot is, out in a space where in the business world they talk about regret capital. That's the money you kept pouring into a failing business, and once it has failed, that you can't pour any more in, but you deeply regret the money that you now realize you've poured in after the signals were clear the business was failing. This is clear for women who leave their husbands in marriages, that almost without exception, if you ask them, did you know earlier you should have left him? The answer is, of course. Do you regret continuing to invest? And at one level, they say yes. And another level, they say, I needed to show myself that I was a person of good character and would not just cut and run. And so you end up with stranded assets, which is why I live in Alberta. And as you may know, Alberta, our main economy rests on oil and gas. We have been told for 25 years we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket, and yet we have. And now, of course, given the state of the environment, we may end up with huge stranded assets, and we're angry at almost everybody except ourselves. Now, by civilization, there's two senses I don't use the word. Civilization P, as in place, as in Eastern or Western civilization, as if somehow civilizations are different just because of the place they are on the planet. That strikes me as not a very helpful thought. And civilization H is honorific, meaning that we're really just talking about a way to talk about big societies that impress us. So we might talk about Chinese or British civilization. Nobody talks about Welsh civilization. So there's no cognitive content gets added by calling China a civilization as opposed to calling it simply a culture with a 5,000-year history. Civilization G is for global, and that's a perfectly useful sense of the word, as in the sentence, human civilization is now at risk. I believe that sentence to be true, and you all understand what I mean by it. That's all of us, all 7.5 billion of us. Civilization F is probably a new meaning of civilization, a new use, so I will explain it. By F, I mean a form of civilization in which the modern industrial way of being in the world is a form of civilization, in the same way an indigenous way of being in the world is a form of civilization. So let me explain. Here you can see in the diagram, the forms of civilization are the rectangles, and the smiley faces are different cultures that exemplify the form of civilization, and they can be very different from each other. The Dog-Rib Cree who live in northern Alberta and the folks who live up the Amazon have very, very different cultures. If you're doing just cultural analysis, they hardly seem similar at all. But they're both exemplars of what we characterize as an indigenous form of civilization. Whereas the folks in civilization B might be modern people in modern industrial cultures. So you've got the Italians, and you've got the Finns, and the French, and the Canadians. And again, lots of differences among those people, but all exemplars of a modern industrial form. And so a form of civilization is a way of knowing, experiencing, and being in reality and being human, the core paradigm of which is fundamentally different from the core paradigm of other forms of civilization. And this distinction, which is kind of like the genus species, analogous to the genus-species distinction, is not yet an idea in good currency. Most analysis is still just done at a cultural level without distinguishing and grouping into forms of civilization, which I find clarifies our thinking. And this is a model that we use in Foresight Canada. It's at the heart of our causal layer synthesis, because these are layers of our humanity and they're causally related. And the easiest way to think about it is the brown is literally physical reality. It's where you do things. You move a pile of dirt, you whittle some wood, you stir some soup. We don't only just do things, though. We actually think about doing things, sometimes while we're doing them, sometimes not. Sometimes we sit back and think about, while we're not, in a sense, doing anything, but we think about doing something else. But we don't just think about things, we actually imagine them in a way that is well beyond thinking. So if I invite you to think about the little green man who's sitting on your lapel, most of you won't do it because you can't imagine that person being there. And the rule is absolutely clear that you cannot think about what you cannot imagine, which is why reshaping our imagination is so much more powerful than just new ways of thinking. And the most powerful thing of all, of course, is when you come to know reality in a fundamentally different way. And any culture has these layers, any person has these layers, and people within a shared form of civilization particularly share things at the outer layers, and the further in they go, the differences may be clear. So just to give an example of how this model works, these are two pictures of classrooms. And you can see that they're actually quite different. That you can, if I ask you which one is older than the other, you can see at a glance that the top left is substantially older than the classroom at the bottom right. And what's more, as you look at them, you can see that each classroom reflects a different way of thinking about the role of teaching, the nature of teaching, is a different imagination of how students relate to each other in the process of learning. And so that what you see is that any embodiment, as Northrop Frye said, the great Canadian literary critic, that in whatever a culture produces, it's a symbol of that culture, whether you're talking about military strategy or poetry or art or economic development. And so as you learn to read physical stuff, you can learn to see in the differences, the different ways of thinking and the different imagination, and sometimes even a different way of knowing reality behind it. Here you have four fundamentally different cultures from top left to bottom right. That mountain in the background, top left, is the first mountain I ever climbed. It is called Yamnuska in Stony Nakota. And that's about 6 miles from where I now live in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And each of these is an imagination of how you would build on the landscape in very different cultures. And one of the things that's interesting is that as time goes by, the height of the top of the building gets further and further from the land. Or you can use this model to think of democracy. If you do it inside out, that is, you privilege hard data, which modern cultures do, by the way. It's one of the things that Karl Marx and capitalists and the Chamber of Commerce all agree on, and that is hard data is better than soft data. So that physical stuff has primacy over mere thinking. And you can see that in our culture. And so if democracy is about the business of elections, that what it means to be a democracy is that people elect their leaders, then you focus there, one person, one vote, and you focus on how you get them to vote and what kind of voting. And you might even, if you're in a competition, try to suppress the vote of others and get your own vote out. And in fact, the mechanics of voting can get to the point that it becomes a very bloody game to simply a game of power as to who wins the vote. Whereas if you do democracy from the outside in, then democracy can be defined as the quality of a relationship to whatever it is you're relating to. You relate to reality respectfully, which then affects the way you imagine the world you're to be in, which demands respectful relationships, the way you think about the world. And you realize that marriages, classrooms, families can all be more or less democratic and not have anything to do with voting. And of course, one of the things that we see today around us is liberal democracy is under threat. I would argue largely because in the modern industrial world, we have so privileged hard data that we have absolutely forgotten. In fact, it's almost impossible to take the politics that are now normal and try to argue that democracy is about respectful relationships. Any 10-year-old would laugh in your face. So that when a new form of civilization emerges, we change the ways, and here's those levels again, those layers, the way we know, imagine, think things through, and conduct ourselves regarding the nature of reality, the nature and power of human persons, and the relationship of persons to reality. A new form of civilization therefore holds the possibility of doing the human in a profoundly different way. So that if Canadians just go to Israel or even France, they're going to places that, broadly speaking, are different cultures, but within a modern industrial form of civilization. Whereas if we go to India or to Saudi, these, you're not in Kansas anymore in a way that's far deeper than going to Ireland. That something has changed here, not good, bad, but just phenomenologically, these people do the human in a way that isn't quite like what you take for granted. And so the trajectory of history changes, new possibilities emerge when a new form of civilization emerges, as they have. So if you go back 14,000 years from the present, there's only one form of civilization. Back then, all people on the planet, they're in every possible continent except the Arctic and the Antarctic. So we're everywhere as a species, but we're all living in small group cultures. We're into the Dunbar number of roughly 150 of some form of indigenous culture. The culture is dramatically different from each other. So that the fact that they're all the same form of civilization says nothing about how different the cultures can be. And if you move ahead about 4,000 years, you find that by 10,000 years ago, some of the indigenous people, but only some of them, have in fact evolved into local, settled, agriculture-based cultures. And again, we're still hovering around the Dunbar number, although some of the towns are larger. And we note that this transition is optional, it's unconscious, it's taken place over a very long period of time, and it's local and regional wherever it appeared, so it appears at different times in different places on the planet. And if we move ahead yet another 4,000 years, we find by then that some regional empires have emerged, whether you're thinking of Egypt or China or the Incas. And regional empires are different again because they have a degree of arrogance that is not found in either local settled cultures or in indigenous cultures. Because both of the first two forms of civilization are so utterly dependent on the land that there's no illusion that in fact they can separate themselves from it. But regional empires are the first form of humanity where a deep arrogance gets built into the culture that exemplifies that. And of course, over the last 1,000 years, we have evolved a modern industrial cultures. And since we came out of regional empires, modern industrial cultures have that arrogance, in fact, in spades, because one of our illusions is that we can separate ourselves from the planet even more. And so, but what I mean when I say that modern industrial civilization is an overshoot is that we moderns are continuing to construe and experience and respond to reality in the terms established by the core paradigms of our inherited modern industrial civilization. And we do this at a time, even though we can no longer make reliable sense of, much less cope with, the existing emerging conditions and complex living conditions, human and non-human, that characterize our time. My sense of where we are in overshoot is in that little purple dot. I don't think we're so far into it that there's no hope for us, but if we continue on the path we're on, the result will be death. So now the question becomes, is our modern industrial civilization, in fact, in overshoot? And if you ask us as a culture, if you ask the official bodies of our culture, that is those who wield power, those who are at the top of our hierarchies, those with the influence, the influencers in the culture, the answer is no, no, no. That as a culture, we don't believe this for a minute. And there are three fundamental reasons. One is that we're quite clear. The story we tell ourselves about the emergence of modernity in history is that modernity is not just another form of civilization. Now, when I was an undergraduate in the 1950s, there was no academic discipline that disagreed with that. Everybody agreed that modernity, that before modernity, the story we told, remember Hobbes, that life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And so the story we told ourselves is before we moderns came along, my God, it was awful. It was corrupted with myths. They burned witches. There was just a terrible time, and they had no modern medicine. And we now, in modernity, do not have cultures the way they have cultures. We don't have religions the way they have religions. We have science and objectivity and truth. And you see sentences like that today in articles, in speeches, in referee journals. Secondly, we believe, as I've already hinted at, that modernity is the end of history. In other words, we're not just the cat's meow. The point of history from this point on is everybody else is going to become modern like us, and then everybody on the planet will be modern and will just sail off into the sunset. And you may remember that Francis Fukuyama wrote his silly little book called The End of History in 1989. At the time, he was cheered as if he was the next Einstein. The Toronto Globe and Mail actually published the whole damn book over 6 days by taking several pages each day because they thought this was such an important piece. Now, reflective people understand that it was a silly book, which is what some of us said in '89, but we were shouted down. But that belief that we've got it and others don't is very deep in us. And therefore, the belief that modernity can and will be made to be sustainable is, of course, the official belief of today. The world's multi-billion-dollar sustainability industry is all about using science, technology, engineering, and math multiplied times money, that's that extra M there, to make modernity sustainable. There's a little bit of talk at the edges to go beyond modernity, but it has no weight at all in the conversation. And so the official project is still, as it was since the end of the Second World War. It's not polite. We try to be more polite about the conversation now. We weren't early on. Development was clear. You will become like us. You don't know anything. We are developed. You are underdeveloped. And if you just sit still and listen to us, we will teach you and you will become fine. And one of the things we taught them is that free trade is good, even for you who are underdeveloped, which let us buy most of their assets cheaply. We forgot that when we were at their stage of development, we had a mercantile system and not free trade at all. But here's the model. It's the bet we're making. It's the bet that your grandchildren's life depends on. Now, my own response to the question of is our modern industrial civilization an overshoot is yes, yes, yes. Take each one of these in turn. That we moderns are culture trapped. As expected, we moderns recognize, read, and construe the data of ourselves and our situation from within the framework of our modern industrial form of civilization. Now, at one level, that's not surprising. Indigenous cultures read the world and behave within it, within an indigenous framework. Moderns do it within a modern framework. What's the surprise there? There really isn't any, unless you happen to believe, as we moderns do, that this is the end of history, so that the thought that we could ever evolve beyond this does not emerge. That this way of knowing reality blinds us to either the need for and the possibility of the emergence of the next form of civilizations. We're not even meta-reflexive enough to say, God, isn't it interesting? There was a time when there was only one form of civilization, and then there were two, and then there were three, and now we've got four, which means in principle, empirically, if something has happened, it can happen. And therefore, in principle, you could kind of say, just as a meta-reflection, there might be something beyond us. But that thought is not a thought that, in fact, has any traction within modernity. And so we're into Adelaide's Lament, which you may remember is a song in Damon Runyon's, the Broadway version of the Damon Runyon story, Guys and Dolls. And the critical piece in the song is that the medicine never gets anywhere near where the trouble is, which means that we have misdiagnosed our situation and therefore respond to it inappropriately. And if we're an overshoot and continue that, the response ultimately is death. And if you don't believe me, then come with me to Horizons Canada. This is a report. If you Google Horizons Canada, you'll find them on the web. And this report, which they did for SSHRC, which is the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, that is the body of senior academics that gives out money to universities for research in the social sciences and humanities. And SSHRC is now conscious enough in the 21st century that, in fact, thinking about the future is something that academics should do. For them, this is a new thing. Others have been doing it for a very long time. But it's a new thing in a formal way in most universities. In fact, in most universities, most of the research hasn't been touched by the thought of futures at all. But SSHRC went to Horizons Canada and said, tell us what the big strategic challenges will be of the 21st century, both for Canadians and others, at least out to 2050 and even beyond that to 2100. And what Horizons Canada did was a major year-long study, and they chunked up the world into these buckets. And so you can see these buckets as well as I can, that one of them is working in a digital economy, another is inhabiting challenging environments, living within the Earth's carrying capacity, truth under fire in a post-fact world. You can see the others. And most of you could write at least a few sentences as to what you'd expect to find. If you were writing a proposal for SSHRC money under global health and wellness in the 21st century, you'd have some idea what you'd have to put into that proposal. And if you could tie it to our humanity in some way, so much the better, because you increase the chances of a grant. And if we said to SSHRC and to Horizons Canada, you've missed something, they would point to that dotted box down in the bottom left-hand corner and say, well, fine, we may have missed something. We're quite happy. What is the 17th issue? And we'd say, no, 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 no. What you've missed is a meta-reflection on the fact that being modern is a particular and a unique way of dividing up the world, that this way of thinking about the challenges we face and dividing it up into watertight boxes is uniquely modern. And the thought that this way of experiencing the world and dealing with it, and therefore investing in it, funding it, and all the rest of it, may itself be a problem, this thought has not occurred to you. The need to transcend modernity and mature into the next form of civilization is not on the list of any 21st century grand challenges. And as you may know, the language of grand challenges emerged in Europe. It is now gone around the world. It's very fashionable. The AAAS in the United States has grand challenges. Lots of people have grand challenges to what we have to do over the next several generations. And on none of those lists, not even in the university institutes that are explicitly dedicated to identifying and mitigating the existential threats to humanity, on none of these lists is the meta-reflexive thought that it's our modernity itself that may be killing us. It's not there. We're blind to it. And so, as you may also know, although you may not, that in fact there's a growing literature, it is growing by leaps and bounds, that we're in trouble. And that we're living beyond the Earth's ecological limits. We're running out of affordable, that is cheap energy. We're dismantling and disrupting the climate. And that much we already know in the literature. The literature is not well developed around the fact that the modern industrial world does not get humans as persons. But there's a growing literature that says sometime in the next 10 to 80 years, we may well face civilizational collapse. That is, our form of civilization, regardless of what the culture. Some cultures may go before others. And so you see that each of those arrows, there's a little straight arrow. That's the 10 to 80 years. If you read the literature, that's the window. Yes, there are some people who give us more than 80 years. There are some people who give us less than 10. Before social turmoil is so intense, it disrupts what we take to be a normal society. This is the future that may well be programmed in. I'm inclined to believe that it is, given what I've read, and I've been reading the literature of cultural crisis and transformation for almost 60 years. But the real tragedy is not that we face collapse. The real tragedy is our attitudes and understanding blinds us to the possibility that ours may be one of those very rare times in history where the next form of civilization may be struggling to be born, and we're oblivious to it. There's no conversation that helps us understand how that differs, what it would be and how it differs from modernity, and therefore how we could present ourselves to reality. Yes, there are a few books that have been written, and there is some conversation, but in terms of its practical outcomes, it's zero. And the difference is that now this transition is required, not optional. It needs to be conscious, not unconscious. It needs to be rapid by any historical standard, and ultimately needs to be scalable as opposed to just being local and regional. And as I've suggested, it's literally not on our agendas. It's not being funded by Shirk. It's not being funded by any serious agency or foundation in the world. And as I've suggested, there are people who are trying to stretch our imaginations. And this is only a sample of them. There's growing numbers of people who are agitated because what they're seeing from the data, what we're fixed on, remember we're modern people who like hard data, and therefore what we're fixed on are the threats to our society in the hard areas, from climate change or epidemics or ocean acidification, something that we can nicely measure. And so there's a sense that we need to get off the road we're on, but there's no clear sense of what the road is other than off the road we're on. It's like a wife saying to her husband, "God damn it, George, you need to be different." Well, even if George, let's assume that he gets that message, but if she doesn't help him with how and in what ways, and what am I now, and where's the edge of that? So how would I know whether my new behavior is actually just a subtle reinforcement of what I am and will actually get me in deeper trouble, or whether in fact it's actually genuinely new behavior? If she can't help me with that, I'm stuck. And if you read a lot of this literature, almost all of it is within the modern industrial frame. That is, none of these people have an actual model of modernity so that they know when they're out. And if you read the literature that they put out, a lot of it is great. There are some wonderful insights that are clearly by the model we use beyond modernity. But in the next sentence, all they're doing is pushing a revised version of modernity, and there's no capacity to sieve these things so that the modern ideas, the refreshed modern ideas, just hang around and the genuinely new things filter out. And so we're culture trapped, even when it comes to most of the conversation about cultural crisis and transformation. So let me now restate this, take a second cut at the missing question. That we moderns think we know these four things. We think we know that human civilization is at risk, and in the three ways that I've listed there. That literature, it's not that everybody believes that. It's not that in the election in Alberta or in Canada in the fall, these will be top of mind things. They'll be a little bit paid attention to the ecological limits, less paid to energy and to the climate. But fundamentally, the promise of every political party, left and right, is that they'll make the industrial age work for us. It's true of the Green Party as well, in that sense. The Green Party is as modern in that sense as Bay Street or Wall Street capitalists. We also think we know that modernity can be made to be sustainable. That's not just a bet we're making, it's an explicit commitment. We also think we know that those in charge can mostly be trusted. Now, we have to know that because our organizations are virtually all hierarchical, that virtually all of the assets in the world are owned by people who run hierarchies. And if they can't be trusted, this whole thing collapses around us in just a mess that we can't cope with. And what's more, that if we trust the people in charge of our organizations, that they can save us because they'll apply science, technology, engineering, math, and money if we'll simply let them. And if you listen to the conversations at Davos, or as university presidents get together, or CEOs, this is very much the tone. That if only you ordinary people would sit down and be still and trust us, just give us your life, and we'll fix things and fix you in the process, which is, of course, the very thing that Donald Trump says is a scam. And I would agree with him. Trump doesn't say much that is true. But that our elites have betrayed the cultures that they lead in the modern world, I think is true in spades. And that goes from bishops to deputy ministers to CEOs to university presidents. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't let your children, you wouldn't let them babysit your kids. They're not corrupt in that sense. But they're simply corrupt because they're absolutely blind to the conversation I'm trying to have with you. We moderns are missing the fact that our emerging crisis is rooted in the exhaustion of our first Enlightenment ways of knowing, imagining, thinking, and living in reality. So this picture of globalization and its consequences, each one of these apparently separate things is actually, if you think about it, a complex living system, and there's all kinds of dynamics within each one of these, let alone among them. And if you understand anything about complex living systems and about modern governance institutions in any sector of our culture, you know that Ezekiel Drawer was right when he said there's not a ghost of a chance of our governance institutions being able to cope with the world that is now emerging around us and within us. Walt Anderson picks up the same theme, but does it in a very positive way to say, we need an imagination that places us as human beings back in the planet. That we need to believe that this cosmos does human consciousness, and therefore love and guilt and hate and whatever else we do, as much as it does copper and cobalt, which of course the First Enlightenment won't let us believe. There's an objective world out there which we subjects, who are totally different from it, see objectively. And then, of course, when we turn those objective eyes to ourselves, we see ourselves with the same objective eyes and don't have any idea. And so we keep ourselves from understanding that our job in the 21st century is to learn to love this cosmos and accept the responsibility in the Anthropocene of being the only species that has any chance of governing it wisely. Now, that's not the old First Enlightenment way. Read Walt's book. It's extraordinary. So the cut of the missing question is this. What if our core work in the 21st century is not to make our modern industrial culture sustainable and humane? What if our new work is conscious civilizational rebirth? That is, what if we have to learn to outgrow and let go of modernity? We're not going to outgrow it economically. We're going to grow it in the same way you outgrow adolescence. You learn to let go of it, comfortable though it is, should you actually be on a path to grow up as a person. And one of the tragedies of our world is that adolescence is built into us biologically where maturity is not. What if we have to learn the new work of nurturing the next form of civilization? And I remind you that no culture on the planet has ever had to do this. So there's no literature, there's no rituals, there's no prayers, there's no wisdom about how to nurture the next form of civilization that is beyond the one we've inherited. What if our job is to learn to dance on the edge of discretion and creativity as modernity disintegrates both within us and among us and around us as we and the next civilization mature together? What if we have to learn to invest in and support this work as our core work in the 21st century, as if our future hangs on it? And I would remind you that there are virtually no institutions in our culture whose job is to make those investments. Yes, there is the Fetzer Foundation in Michigan, who has been working in its own way at these things for decades. But the Gates Foundation hasn't got a clue. And tragically, the Fetzer Foundation isn't even a rounding error of the Gates Foundation. So that most of the foundations we have, most of the programs we have, are to gussy up and do a better job of our modernity, not to help us outgrow it and outlive it. And so if you want a visual picture of where I think we are, that our time, you can see 1918. Now I'm doing this in 1919 in February. That, in my view, we're already past peak modernity. I'm, of course, not the only one who says that, but we're a very small number of voices. That mostly what's promised us in elections and from our CEOs and university presidents is that if we only give them enough money, they can make sure modernity goes on forever. And I don't think there's any chance of that at all. I think we're into a long disintegration of modernity regardless of what we do. The only question is the speed and the destruction of it. And that white line is a Seneca cliff, because complex systems tend to disintegrate that way. And we're not sure where that is ahead of us, whether it's 2 months, 2 years, or 2 decades. There's also a new form of civilization. That's that little gold line. But sadly, the signals for it are not the kind of signals that First Enlightenment science recognizes. First Enlightenment science, remember, cast everything about us as persons to outer darkness and said, just do that as consenting adults behind closed door. Don't bring it to the office. Don't bring it to the lab. And therefore, the signals that something new is growing within us and among us are not even signals that we can pick up for public purposes. It's one of the ironies and one of the tragedies. It's kind of the universe saying to us, well, if you want to play the silly buggers game that you've played this long, you have the right to do that, but it may kill you. Part of the price is the kind of humility Don Michael would have encouraged us to have, and that is, let's pretend for a while that what we know is this big and what we don't know is this big, and try to govern ourselves accordingly. But it also means then that the 21st century will be a century of strategies that are bridging strategies. That is, strategies that are some mix of what we know in modernity and some mix of what we think we're coming to know of the next form of civilization, to point us in that direction, that they'll be more pregnant with the future when successful. They'll be more pregnant with the future than the people around us know. The people around us will say, for God's sake, do we really have to be this risky? To which the answer is yes. And they'll finally let us get away with it. And when it works, they will come back, and it will mostly be years later, and say, really glad you suggested we do that. It's turned out way better than we thought. So good on you. And of course, most people don't bother doing that. And so in that sense, the signals that you're doing well, don't expect to live on them long. So if this is the case, if we are in civilizational overshoot as modern industrial cultures, let's ask Lenin's question, what is to be done? And the first thing we need to do is take a meta perspective on doing. I've already suggested that our modern industrial world likes hard data over soft, and therefore the closer you get to smaller circles, the better off we are. And therefore, when Lenin's question is asked, mostly people think, what are we going to do in the sense of actually move dirt, turn a dollar, or get people out to a meeting? We don't think it's doing anything to learn to present yourself to reality in a way that you can know it differently and it knows you differently. That kind of revelation isn't to do anything, except of course it is. That doing something occurs at every one of those levels, and we need to be doing fundamentally new things at every level. And the silliness of our culture, our innovation systems, if you look at them, reward you for doing the brown and a little bit of the blue, and occasionally wander out a smidge into the yellow. But our innovation systems, ironically, are one of the things that are keeping us locked into modernity. Because God bless them, it's not that they're in any sense bad people, but most of the people who now spend most of our serious money are addicted to science, technology, engineering, and math in a first Enlightenment way. And they're frightened like hell to look at any other alternative. And if you don't believe that, look at the growing literature in the scientific community. Look at the ads that AAAS runs to raise money for science and for AAAS that are akin to the ads that Republicans run after the Democrats have said something that they think is foolish. So what do we have to do? We have to learn to live the missing question. LC stands for our learning capacity. LCH is the learning capacity we already have. When it comes to this missing question, that's quite small. LCR is the learning capacity that is required in our situation. If our situation is at all as I think it is, as I've come to understand it, then the learning capacity we have compared to the learning capacity that is required is way less than 1. And survival requires that the learning capacity we have is at least as great as the learning capacity that is required. This is Ashby's law of requisite variety, simply applied to governance. And at this point, we're failing. So we have to learn to live that in our lives, in our families, in our organizations, in our communities. Brian Goodwin was reflecting in an article a couple of years ago on the long history, the 4 decades of the emergence of complexity theory, and at a meta level, what it's teaching us. And he said the scientific knowledge originally seemed to make possible the prediction and manipulation of nature Absolutely true. That project is at the heart of the First Enlightenment. And if you know anything about that history, you know that that's the case. But scientific knowledge, he says, appears now to be pointing us towards a new relationship with the natural world. That's that outer edge of our model, based on sensitive observation and participation rather than control. So how does that play out? Well, I live in the part of the world where if you go out for a walk, you may run into certainly a dog that's strange to you. You may even run into a bear. Some of them are brown, occasionally it's a grizzly. Trust me, even if you meet a strange dog, let alone a bear, you want a relationship that is acutely sensitive observation and the kind of participation that is friendly rather than the kind that ends up with your death. And it certainly, there's no illusion of control. Think of approaching your lover. What you're hoping for is participation. This is not strange stuff. And so what do we have to do? We have to learn to cooperate with our own evolution. And that's true at every scale that we live, from individual persons to the whole of humanity on the planet. We have to trust and model steadfast love more than the power of power and the power of money. In the modern industrial world, the power of power and the power of money are what runs things. And steadfast love has its place to grease the wheels a bit. But almost always when push comes to shove, the power of power and the power of money eat steadfast love for breakfast. And unless we know reality powerfully enough, that steadfast love is in fact the last word about this cosmos, there isn't a ghost of a chance that we can change the trajectory that we're on. Because the power of power and the power of money is in love with modernity because of what it lets them do. We have to embrace the new work of transcending modernity. That's both a societal and civilizational project and a personal project. We have to embrace the new work of transcending our own modern personhood. This is as much a personal journey as is the journey of my gender no longer remaining as unconscious male chauvinist pigs. It doesn't mean we've finished that journey. I've been at that 5 decades, and I know enough about its subtlety to know that I'll die with some elements in my life still shaped by the culture I've inherited and the person that I was shaped into in my early years. We have to develop a post-despair hope. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the American jurist, said that he wouldn't give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but would give much for the simplicity the other side of complexity. Well, I've come to the view that the official optimism and the superficial hope that absolutely characterizes modern cultures isn't worth anything. That it cannot withstand despair, and there will be despair as modernity disintegrates and as the promises that we have made to ourselves and each other cannot be met. And unless there is a place in our life to develop a post-despair hope, we will be casualties who need to be carried off the field rather than those who can care for those who are casualties and who can do the new work. So we have to learn then to work in ways and at levels and at scales that fit your own personal circumstances. I'm not saying you have to become and do the work that I'm doing. The work that I do is my work. It is my life and my passion and my calling. Your work, whatever that is, will be dramatically different because you're a different person in your own situation and circumstances and of life. And the point of this is that all of the work of co-creating a new culture has to be done. From reading to the blind on Tuesday night to reimagining the situation we're in. And so we have to live our civilizational journey. Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who wrote this to me in a private letter almost 40 years ago, he founded the Harvard Institute of World Religions. And he said, Butch, which is how he knew me, I've spent much of the last 40 years endeavoring to understand worldviews other than those we in the West have inherited, what I've called forms of civilization. And in the last several years, I've been particularly concerned with the question of what's involved in the endeavor to understand and help others understand an outlook different from the one already has. That is, an outlook that one has inherited. And one of the conclusions to which I've come is that in order to even understand a different view, especially if it be radically different and or profound, comprehensive, humane, one must oneself become a different sort of person. And the irony is that the good folks at Harvard, who have the biggest endowment in the world, don't even know what they have in the Institute of World Religions. And they've yet to let its wisdom influence their business school. For inspiration, I turned to John McMurray. He was the chief of philosophy at Edinburgh, where the chief of philosophy at Queen's, when I studied there, was a student. So Sandy Duncan, my chief, was a student of John McMurray's. And McMurray has done wonderful stuff if you don't know him. Sandy invited him to Queen's in 1949 to give the Dunning Truss lectures under the heading The Conditions of Freedom. And one of the things he said is that to be rid of illusions, if it does not break our courage, is a liberating experience. And what Don Michael was devoted to was the experience of being liberated from human illusions and being present with each other as persons to give ourselves the strength not to have that break our courage. And I hope you've seen some of that in me and in this presentation, because this is what we're called to. Over to you. The future is in our hands, hearts, and minds. Thank you. And this is where you can reach me. As I noted, I would be happy to hear from you, whether objections or building on it in ways, because this work has hardly begun. Thank you.